Welcome. Thank you for joining us this morning for a closer look at the Garden of Stones with Museum of Jewish Heritage President and CEO Jack Kliger and world-renowned artist Andy Goldsworthy, who brought the Garden of Stones to life. I'm Jory Sheriff, Senior Manager for Membership Initiatives at the museum. And if you've ever joined one of our virtual member programs, you know I say this before every single one, but I really do mean it. Thank you so much for being members. Your support really allows us to bring member programs online when we can't be together in person. So thank you. And of course, thank you to our friends at Gallery Lalong who represent Andy here in New York. We'll save 10 minutes for Q&A at the end of the program, and I'll let you know when that is so that we can start taking questions. When it's time to do so, you can type your question into the Q&A box, which is located at the bottom of your screen. So now please give a warm virtual welcome to Jack Kliger, who will start us off.
Thanks, Jory, for that very nice introduction. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us. And of course, a special thanks to our guest, Andy Goldsworthy, for joining us all the way from Dumfries in southern Scotland. And Andy, thank you not only for all you've done over the years, but especially for what you've done for our institution. So in a diverse career spanning 5 decades, Andy Goldsworthy has become one of the most prominent contemporary sculptors of our day. Born in Cheshire, England, and now based in Scotland, Andy Goldsworthy's iconic works explore the relationship between humans and their natural surroundings and the beauty in loss and regeneration. In addition to the Garden of Stones at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust, Andy's work can be found worldwide. Major solo exhibitions have been presented by the Yorkshire Sculpture Park in England, the Museum of Contemporary Art in San Diego, the Metropolitan Museum of Art here in New York, and many more. Welcome, Andy, and thank you again for being our guest today.
It's a pleasure.
I always wait at this point for applause, then remember we can't hear it, so I'm applauding for everybody. Before we jump into our conversation, Andy, I'd like to give some context about how the Garden of Stones came to be and the cultural moment in which it was created. The museum's architect, Kevin Roach, had always intended for there to be a beautiful outdoor memorial garden and left an open 4,150 square foot outdoor space in the floor plans for it. A competition for the design of the garden was hosted by the museum and run by the Public Art Fund, which was created in January of 2002. Now, this was right after the September 11th events, which of course cast a new tone over the whole process. So 100 artists were invited to submit proposals for the garden design, and 25 artists responded to the solicitation, including Andy Goldsworthy. A memorial garden competition committee made up of trustees, survivors of the Holocaust, and outside advisors reviewed the 25 proposals in February of 2002 and invited 5 artists to submit more detailed second round proposals. Of the 5 finalists, they selected Andy Goldsworthy's design in May of 2002. So Andy, can you talk about what inspired you to participate in the competition and in the process of creating the garden?
Well, I think that it's been quite a while, so unpicking what happened around that time is not the easiest of things. But I was invited, and that's important. And the prospect of making a work in such a place, in such a context, was certainly a challenge. And but generally speaking, I don't usually do competitions, because the works that I do are often not so clearly defined, and they don't really suit a committee-run or competition-led commission.
Right.
In this case, because the public fund ran it, they did models for everybody. They did all of the things that I would normally not do with a commission. So they were very important in making a kind of a level playing field to allow artists such as myself who aren't quite as resolved in their ideas to have a voice in that context.
Had you ever had any projects related to the specifics, the Holocaust itself, or was this sort of the first that was in that area of, I would say, commissioning or whatever?
This would be the first in a Holocaust as a Holocaust memorial garden for sure. But there are often sense of the memorial, the idea of people being part of a place and no longer here, that run deep in the work. But this is a very specific context for that, for sure.
Understood, understood. Jory, perhaps we can go into some images, and Andy, perhaps you could describe the process of how you prepared it, and also of the actual getting to the point of installing.
Well, I made a proposal. I'd have to remind myself of what I said at the time, but it was basically to make
the proposed drawing is sort of an interesting point to review when you had made it. Yeah.
Yeah, no, the drawings are always very important to articulate what I do, what I want to do. I mean, the astonishing thing is, for a kind of a sketch and a leap into the unknown for me, which is this work was, how remarkable the work looks like that now. That often does surprise me. The proposal was based on this. I'd always been attracted by trees growing in unusual places in New York, out of the side of a building. It's an expression of resilience and tenacity, and the ability of life to survive in the most difficult circumstances, and which is obviously the underlying relevance to it being a Holocaust memorial garden. So it was to have these trees growing out of stone.
Yeah. And were you conscious of the particular significance of stones as a place of memorial in the Jewish faith for people who have been lost or have passed away, the commemorative images?
No, not particularly, and I didn't want to, because I am not Jewish, and I didn't want to get too self-consciously involved in that too much. I wanted it to come out of things that are common to everybody,
right?
And we all feel, and I think that to go a little deeper, if you like, and that's something
Sure.
I've always felt. I mean, I live in Scotland, and trees are decimated by sheep. We don't have trees in the hills because sheep eat them. So they often survive by growing out of a rock or on the top of the rock. So they are kind of familiar icons of tenacity, if you like, Scottish landscape. And there's a long history of my interest in that. But this was an opportunity to really pursue it and articulate feelings around it in a way that I'd never had the opportunity to do previously.
So the idea of resilience and renewal was there all the time in the things you had done before and since. That's a sort of constant theme.
Yes, it is. It's something that's very apparent to anybody who works with the land. Is the ability to renew, and also for things to die and to grow back, and this cycle of change that occurs, and the tension and overcoming the difficulties of incredibly difficult situations for retreat. I mean, a tree choosing, or not choosing, but managing to grow out of a rock is an astonishing feat as an expression of life.
So your inspiration had always come in some way from the land and the ability to overcome, geographical and natural circumstances to survive, in effect, and to
Well,
thrive.
not just in the land, but also in the city. The tree. I remember when I was, I think, when I was doing a site visit and coming out, I looked out of the hotel window up in New York, and I could see, and I got a photograph of this tree growing out of the side of a building, and it was all that concrete, this tree growing. I mean, it was an amazing, amazing thing. So it's not just something out with the city; it's in the city too.
Yes, I see. But that's a very good point. It's not just land itself. It's land and people and how they work together. And at that point, so how long did the actual process of the installation take place? I mean, did you already have the boulders identified, or did you have to find them? And talk about how what was then commissioned became a fact on the ground. Well, I oftentimes talk about facts on the ground, but in this case, we're really talking about a fact on the ground. So talk about how that sort of happened.
Well, the initial idea was approved, accepted, but that, then it had to change from being a drawing and an idea into form.
Yeah.
And that's a process that was initiated once I had the commission, and it continues to this day. It has not stopped. It is an ongoing process where the work is evolving over time. Where would I get the stones from? I knew I could find some. I knew there were stones upstate of New York. I wanted to go on and look for them, and I went searching for stone. And it was quite interesting, the whole kind of social nature of the stones, in that near to New York, they were really expensive due to all the landscaping uses of them. As you got further up north to Vermont, they were almost paying me to take them out of the field, So there's this sort of social kind of perspective on the stones. It was quite interesting. And all the stones came from the side of a field or where they'd been moved. So they'd been already, they're glacially deposited granite boulders. So they were on a journey already through the glacial activity. And then the farmers had pulled them out of the field and put them to the sides of the field. So they'd been moved once more. I would have been very reluctant to have taken a stone embedded in the landscape.
Sure.
Movement is part of this work. The stones are on a journey, and that journey is important to the idea of the work and where they found their home in Manhattan. Right. And this is I had to figure out how to carve the stones. There was a hole cut in the top where the tree is going to be planted, but then it had to be scooped out on the underside, right. And that was done by fire with a torch. And that was, for me, an appropriate way to work with an igneous fire-formed rock, which is what granite is. So this shows them in a quarry where we collected the stones and did the hollowing out. But those stones came from New York up to Vermont.
So they came from New York up to Vermont?
I think some came from around the Storm King area, and then further than upstate. I think eventually we ended up getting most in Vermont because my project manager at that time, Jacob Ehrenberg, he lived in Vermont, and they were found by looking and meeting people and going to farmers and asking them if I could have their stone, and that's also
that's an interesting story in itself, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And did you understand the significance? I mean, the number 18 plays a very important role. There were 18 stones. Was that dictated? Not. I mean, there's a significance to the number 18 in the Jewish religion, but Was it space that dictated that, or did you fit the 18 to the space? Was 18 a factor?
It was the space. It
Uh-huh.
really was the space. I mean, I think that the significance of 18 may have been in mind, but I took that out of my criteria because I wanted it to be right
Yeah,
for the space, not to force that number into the space. For that
got it.
reason, it was quite astonishing that at the end it came out at 18, but that was purely about this.
Right, which is amazing when you, because it's such a significant number for Jewish people, and particularly the commemorative aspect, but you were working to fit the space rather than work, here's 18, how do we make it work?
No, I have a strong belief that the whatever I make has to come from a truth of some kind that is in the relationship, in the material, in the that I don't want to put these layers on it from above, but somehow it to come out of the work itself, and this obviously did so in this instance.
And during the process of doing this, I see that we show some pictures of colleagues, and also here we have pictures of, I believe, some survivors who were involved in.
Well, these are not survivors. This is
No.
my mother.
Ah, a survivor of a different sort. But, yeah.
And on the right is Sherry Mallin, who is what I would like to call my American mother. She and Joel Mallin, her husband, have looked after me and my family and supported me. They commissioned one of the very first works I ever made in the US. So we go way back. So this was an amazing moment to have those two women plant trees, but the rest of the trees were planted by Holocaust survivors.
And there's a photo of Edith Koftel, who passed away a few years ago in 2013, planting one of the first trees. And you selected specifically the seedlings of plantings from a certain kind of tree, or was that a factor?
Well, I had to find a tree that I wanted it to be a native tree, and so I looked at trees that survived or did well in difficult circumstances in rocky ground, and these are dwarf oak. I mean, being in the site itself is a very abrasive site, close to the water.
Sure.
The whole thing was a huge act of faith, a leap of faith that this would, that it would work. And it's an astonishing act on the part of the museum to allow me to do that. But that element of risk and chance and vulnerability and precariousness is written deep into the work. And that's what gives it soul.
Yeah. And how, were you there for the planting of most of those trees?
I planted, all the 18 were planted, the first 18 were planted. And then, as you know, 17 of the 18 trees died after that. And there's only one tree from the original planting. And then the rest have been replaced over as they died.
Over the course of the years, yeah. And that was always, as I understand it, not necessarily the timing, but you had always expected that the trees would have to go through their life cycle, die, and be replanted at some point.
Well, it was pretty quick, you know, like a year or two or a few months, and so that was a slightly heady moment that was unexpected. But you know, I mean, basically, they were being loved too much. They were being overwatered, and it was only when we got Charles Day, who we'll hear from later, the gardener, who started looking after them, and his role in this work can't be underestimated.
I agree.
So important. And now they're at this stage, which is quite astonishing. And when I came back, I visit the garden periodically, and but hadn't been for several years when I came to give a talk recently. I forget when it was, about three years ago.
Yeah.
And seeing the trees growing like it was just so emotional for me,
Yeah.
because
I'm sure.
it had been such a risk,
Yeah.
and it struggled so much, and there they were growing. It was an amazing moment for me.
Yes, and for so many of us who just come and look at it every day, about how connected it is to the story of the survivors and how they struggled so much. It is really an amazing sense. Um, there's a shot of the Statue of Liberty in the background. Was that something you had considered when you were doing the project, realizing that you'd have this installation that beyond the resonance of the story, beyond the history and everything, you'd wind up being in a place where you could look at and see the Statue of Liberty behind it?
Well, that's Kevin Roche aligning the garden with the statue. It was wonderful. It's a wonderful site, wonderful place to place the work, and it was incredible. But what is interesting, I know you've now put in some pictures showing the trees out with summer, but in the run-throughs to this presentation, we were definitely erring towards the ones showing the trees all lush and all green.
Yeah.
And in reality, that's this is a very special moment in the garden, in that they're coming to fruition, or more or less at the same time. This will never happen again. The next few years. This is a
Why?
peak.
Because we'll be replanting in sequence and stuff
Well,
like that?
what will happen is, the intention was, for me, the moment they reach their peak is when the tree wells with the stone, so that you cannot see the earth, but it's just tree and stone. That is when they're at their most beautiful. This one quite hasn't reached it yet, but there's just tree and stone. But that's also the moment that the tree will be under pressure and will eventually die.
Yeah.
And
Which
so
is part of life and part of regeneration, and bring new ones in, isn't that sort of?
that's so written into the work. But it is interesting now that they're looking so lush and fresh and beautiful, that we are being possibly seduced by the beauty of it, and there is this underlying change that's going to occur, and then people are going to say, oh no, they're dying.
Yeah.
What are we going to do? What are we going to do? And that, I've always said that the dead trees should be left amongst the living trees as part of the work. And in years to come, this kind of sequence won't be as uniform. There'll be a young tree, an old tree, a mature tree, a dead tree, and they will be all there alongside of each other. That, for me, is the unfolding of this work. The story that is creating for itself is for me the real reward of this piece. And these things, this sculpture, and these things were not so clearly resolved at the beginning. I wasn't sure how this would work and but I've learned so much from the making of this, from Garden of Stones, and it has been with me since its making, always in my mind how this would work out, and it is so dependent upon the people who look after the garden, and that it's not just an act of gardening, it's an act of love.
Yes.
And an act of understanding. And it's a very complex work. You'll hear Charles talking about it, but what he says is nothing compared to what he feels for it. And that instinctive understanding of what the tree needs. It is I have felt it's been in such safe hands with Charles. And that is what to one degree or another, I'm always looking for whenever I make a work, even if it doesn't involve growing trees, someone who has a feeling for the work, Yeah, this was this work was, I mean, I think it's 15, 20 years old. On the right-hand side is the sculpture. It was bought by, is stacked together, and it was bought by a Belgian collector, and I installed it in his garden. And we had this agreement that I would replace it when it decayed. And again, I wasn't quite understanding how it would work out or what. But anyway, this tree, by chance, started growing out of the top of the work and has become the work. It's actually a far more interesting sculpture now, 15 years later than it was when it was first made, because of that tree. And as the ball of oak branches decays, the tree will grow bigger and bigger. So there's this balance and relationship between the two. And it's wonderful to see, to work, to collaborate with people like the collector here, who was able to make that journey with the work. And not many people are, not all people are. Well, it's rotten, it's falling apart. I want a new one, you know. Well, actually, you could see it like that, or you could see it as this amazing transition, and this, again, another expression of life growing out of the new life growing out of the old. Beautiful image.
And this is in your project in Ohio.
Yes, this is an orchard in Ohio, and it's a remnant of what were extensive orchards in the place that I was working. And this was the last remnant of that of the orchard. So I made the orchard into a sculpture, and there were many dead trees, and how to work with that. I made 2 apple houses. One contained a dead tree, and one contains apples. So there's life and death there. You can actually eat an apple from these trees underneath the plants. You know, there's this apple house you can go down into and pick an apple and eat in there. But the dead trees were interesting. And when I was trying to deal with the dead trees, that shows the orchard. And there's a little frame there in the orchard that shows where one of the houses is now made.
And you, yeah, there you go. There's one of the dead trees, the one tilting to the side.
Yeah, there's several in there, and so I had to figure out what to do with the dead trees, because and this is where how do I explain to the Museum of Jewish Heritage when to take a tree down, when to, you know, the danger is that you're going to get someone there after Charles that wants it really neat, and to remove anything that looks dead and pull it out and plant, and possibly even try and grow a full-size tree to replace it immediately, which I would abhor, you know?
I see, yep.
So what kind of parameters, what kind of instructions can I give to explain when to remove a tree? And then to some extent, there's a similar issue here, how to explain to people when a dead tree should be removed. And there were many dead trees. I wanted them to stay, but recognized that at some point they will be removed. So I started pulling the tree, and when I could physically break the tree, that's when it should be removed. And I would say this, yeah, now here I am, this is a dead tree, and I'm walking along a dead branch slowly and edging along, feeling my way, getting further and further out, not knowing when it would break. And that uncertainty of when that would happen.
So you expected it to break, or you would just?
Oh, I knew it. It was a dead tree. I knew it would break at some point, but when, I had no idea. And that element of shock happened. But
nice fall.
Yeah, no, I did okay. It's amazing how, even though I was expecting it, how unexpected it was when it happened.
Right.
And that tension, it doesn't look very high, but it was high enough.
So when you described that process of originally putting it in, and that was where you saw the vision, did the people then at the museum who were involved in the installation, the committee, or did they understand? Did they get it?
I don't know. We'll find out. But I can now say,
Right.
because of this work I made in the orchard, that no tree should be removed until it can be pulled out or broken by a person. And that's very different to you going in with a saw and
Yep.
drilling them out and cutting them out. There is a physical human relationship,
Right.
with the removal of the tree that makes sense.
Absolutely.
So
and I can tell you, Andy, that the museum will treat those precious objects as they should be treated, with respect, and we will do it the right way going forward.
yes, I'm asking you to break the tree, which is an act of respect, but not a usual act of respect towards an artwork.
Yeah. Well, last week we had our annual event called Generation to Generation, in Hebrew, Lador Vador. And it's very important for us as a Jewish people to respect succeeding generations and the passing down of history, culture, tradition, and respect. And I don't think anything quite captures that sense of generation to generation and the evolving and the passing of that kind of tradition as much as the Garden of Stones. And in fact, within the museum itself, maybe you don't realize, but just since 2003 and the maturing of the trees, we are going through our own passing from generation to generation as not only the second generation children of survivors, but their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren, many of whom were at the plantings, are now grown and are now passing on the tradition. So for me, and I know for many, there is nothing that quite symbolizes the concept of Lador Vador and generation to generation as much as the concept in the Garden of Stones execution. So the museum will always be grateful to you for that, and we will absolutely respect the concept as you have described it. And so maybe for a young Scottish guy who grew up in England and Scotland, that wasn't necessarily the highest cultural implication, but I have to tell you, you did it in a way that does everybody at the museum and everybody who understands the passing from generation to generation.
Don't get me wrong. I think this is just so moving for me.
Yeah, that is. So Andy, this is all fascinating work, and I think we're at the point where we want to give a little behind the scenes look at how the garden is cared for. And we have done a video interview with Charles Day, who you have mentioned before, who is also a hero of this effort and who has had a lot to do with the trees surviving and being replaced and replenished. And so, Jory, do you think we could tee up the Charles Day video and have him sort of give us some behind the scenes information?
Hello, I'm Charles Day. I'm a horticulturist and I've been looking after the trees here at the Garden of Stones for more than 15 years. I became involved about a year after they were first planted and have been helping them stay alive ever since. It's called the Garden of Stones, and yet stones are not known for their friendliness to plant life. But here we see 18 trees growing fairly happily in stones. So how does this work? Well, each stone has a hole in it. In fact, within the stone there's an even bigger hole. It's rather like an upside down flower pot. This is a flower pot, a nice clay one. Big hole and a smaller hole in the top. The stones were hollowed out and filled with soil, and each seedling was planted in the hole at the top. By now the roots of all the trees have filled the cavity inside their stones and are exploring the freedom of the gravel below. But there were some problems with growing something in this type of container. When a pot is used the normal way up, you can see the soil and feel it, and you can tell whether it is dry or wet. With the pot this way up, it's harder to look inside. When we were replanting some of the seedlings to replace those that had died in the first year, I buried some small moisture sensors inside the stones, just a few of them. They have cables which can be connected to a device that tells me the moisture levels, and we can then regulate the irrigation. There is irrigation. It was planned right at the start, little pipes that dribble water into the soil inside each stone. But without the sensors, it was hard to know whether there was too much water or not enough. Fast forward 15 years or so, and most of these sensors have died. But that's not too much of a problem, because now most of the trees, I don't know if you can see in this shot, have completely filled the hole in the top of their stone, and we know for a fact that there's no rainwater getting inside to the roots, and they're entirely reliant on our irrigation. In summer we have to run it on a fairly regular basis, 2 or 3 times per week for say half an hour each time. It also helps that the trees have rooted into the gravel because they can find some natural moisture there. Besides water control, there was another challenge with this particular species of oak. It is the dwarf chestnut oak, botanical name Quercus prinoides. It's not your average oak. It's a species native to North America and grows naturally in rocky, gravelly and sandy places. It was chosen on the advice of Cornell University as being a good subject for this exercise. It can grow to 15 or 20 feet high, maybe even taller in rich soil, but contained in their rocks, these might not grow much more than they already have. One of the significant things about this tree is that it doesn't like being transplanted. The seedlings are very unhappy. They just want to germinate where the acorn drops. Please leave me alone. They really don't appreciate being moved from one place to another. For this reason, it took a number of attempts to get them established in the Garden of Stones. I tried some fresh acorns one time, but even they didn't seem to be quite fresh enough. There are a few species of oak like this, where the acorn drops and germinates right away. They decide that this is where they are and this is where they want to stay. Eventually we did have success, and speaking of acorns, these trees often produce lots of them. I looked this morning, but maybe the squirrels have helped themselves.
Well, I think Charles is watching today, and if you are, or even if you're not, thank you, Charles, not only for giving us your tour, but taking such wonderful, loving care of these, of this beautiful installation. So thank you for that. I'm now going to turn it back to Jory for Q&A, but before I do, Andy, I want to know if you have anything else you'd like to say before our Q&A, or if there's anything that you understand now that you didn't understand then when you first started this.
I think, like I said, I think we're at such an important moment in the garden when the trees are coming to the maturity, and the how to allow it to develop and change is the parameters are now falling into place, and having someone like Charles is incredibly important. And Charles, if you must give us notice should you ever wish to retire, which I hope is not in the near future, but you really do need someone to work alongside Charles for a considerable amount of time.
Yes.
Charles thinks he can just pass it on because he's doing things as a gardener that I do as an artist just instinctively.
Yeah.
It feels so easy for us, but it's not. What he's achieved is quite incredible and a great achievement, and it will be very important that whoever takes on that role has that sensibility towards the garden and an underlying understanding of its needs.
Very good point, and thank you, Andy. And we will do our own version of Generation to Generation with Charles and his successor. It will go both ways. So, Andy, you know, I hope that you'll be able to come again in the not too distant future to the museum. I'd love to walk through Garden of Stones with you, and just from all of us at the museum, we cannot thank you enough for what you've done and what we think is a spiritual center of the museum. So thank you, Andy. And I will now turn it back to Jory to handle any. Do we have any questions, Jory?
We do. We have some. Also, sorry for the technical.
No, it was fine. It was that helps to show that this is a live
live TV.
Right.
We do have a couple questions, and we have time for some. So if you would like to type your question into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, you're welcome to do so. Okay. We can start off. One member had a question. Can you talk more about, Andy, the process of hollowing out the boulders? Does fire really burn and wear away stone?
It does, yes. And it was one of several options that I had to consider. One was cutting the stone with chisels and blades and hollow it out as you would a mine. We also tried water, high pressure water, which was effective up to a point. But the fire, the heat, was the most effective, and the one, as I said, most in the nature of the material, you know, the relationship to stone. And it was a hugely dramatic process too, because you can't heat it too much or too little. And the man who was doing it, he's done this all his life, cutting with. It was a technology that was originally developed for quarrying, to cut through granite, to cut out slabs.
I think you know, people are very moved by the symbolic idea of survivors planting the trees and having their families and children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren carry on this life cycle of regeneration. I know we did this once with you before in 2003 when the trees were initially planted, but I guess this is a question for both you and Jack, but do you think we might do another replanting when it's time to replace the trees?
You mean with survivors?
Yeah, with survivors.
Well, my understanding, and Andy, I'll let you speak about it, but my understanding is this will be not all at once, but sequential as the occasion occurs. Mm-hmm. Andy, I would think we would love to have survivors, perhaps grandchildren and future generations, participate in that process. But Andy, why don't you tell us whether that is possible or workable or whatever?
That was always the hope.
Yeah.
We always hoped. I think that's written down somewhere in the proposal. That's an act that can be done by, unless that becomes burdensome, and then there's got to be a sense of pragmatism in these things. But it would be wonderful. It would be wonderful if that was continued.
It will not be in any way burdensome for us to have survivors and their, well, I think this would be a great thing to work with our young friends and third and fourth generation groups to talk, to plan this. I can tell you logistically, we will do whatever it is, because it would be the only way we could do it appropriately out of respect and tradition. So yes, we will.
Now that again, that means a lot to me. There are a lot of these things that are hopes and expectations, but you know, I've worked long enough now to know that what I say isn't necessarily what can be achieved or what people can do to. And I've often said about the big projects, that one of the differences between the big projects and, say, the ephemeral work is when an ephemeral work's finished, and typically it falls apart, it decays and goes. The big projects, the moment they're finished, that's when they begin. That's when their life starts. Yeah. And in many ways, they are far more vulnerable than the ephemeral work. because they are so in the hands of the people who are looking after them. And like I said, unless they are loved and understood, they'll die as works. And they do need people. The social nature of my sculptures isn't really appreciated, and it's a huge part of the works.
Well, it is one of the things that I know you can't commit to what will happen in the future, but we can, and I can tell you that we, at the museum, we make a pledge whenever we gather with survivors that there will always be a place for their grandchildren's grandchildren to come and visit and remember and learn and teach. And so we will always have a member of the survivor groups involved in the replanting and the going forward as these trees go through their generational evolution.
Very much.
Jory, any more questions? We have a few more minutes, I think, and I don't think Andy's fully tired yet, but let's keep going.
Sure, yeah, we do. So this is just requires a little bit of context. Our core collection, for those of you who haven't been to the museum yet, I realize many of you joined as members during our temporary closure. But our core collection is sort of housed in a six-sided building at the museum.
Design, right, the original.
Kevin Roach design, yes. And so this question from one of our members, this is for Andy. Andy, do you have thoughts on the six-sided MGH building and its symbolism? And if so, how does that sculpture interact with your sculpture in the garden?
That's not something that I ever cross my mind. I love the building and going off the street through the building into the garden and the elevator. But I know I'm not. I'd not really considered the six-sided nature of the building. I have my limits.
You may not have considered it, Andy, but the visual when we shoot within the Garden of Stones with a six-sided building in the back, not the view towards the Statue of Liberty, but the opposite. I don't know if you saw that at the end of September, because of COVID, we blew the chauffeur from Auschwitz, and it was videoed and played in a number of synagogues, and the settings in which we had the chauffeur blown was in the Garden of Stones with a six-sided building in the background. It was such a dramatic and impactful photograph that it was published on page 5 of the New York Times when they did a story on COVID-related chauffeur blowing. I don't know if we ever sent you that photo.
I'd love to see that.
Yeah, I think we'll even send you one that could be framed. You might be able to use it. But it was a very dramatic and beautiful thing. And like you said, I don't think it was planned for that dramatic impact, but the result was a very dramatic feeling. So Jory, press on.
Okay, I think we have time for just a couple more. We actually have several questions about the oak tree in particular, in this particular species. A couple of people have asked, how, someone says, my question is about oaks and how they connect to each other underground. In the stones, they are cut off from their parent oak. Did you consider that as a part of the metaphor for this work?
Again, it was determined primarily by the tree's ability to survive in difficult situations, and also to be of whilst it's a dwarf tree, it looks like a scaled down mature tree. It's not a shrub, it's a tree, although it's the size of a shrub. It's not a bush, it's a tree. So those were the things that drove the reasoning for choosing that particular tree. But of course, it's going to make all sorts of connections. The oak, what the meaning of the oak, and what did you say that
the underground root system connect to each other under the.
Because they will, yes, they've been separated, but now connecting with each other underneath the stones. There's earth underneath, so the roots will be creeping throughout the garden. So there will be
connection.
Yeah.
That's a very interesting point, and one that was a very interesting question. And I wish we had Charles Day here to talk a little more about all of that stuff, but maybe we can ask Charles to give us a written description, and we can forward that to the questioner. But yes, it's very nice to hear that the root systems themselves will connect under the visible parts. Jory, go ahead.
Yeah, along those lines, one member is highlighting the sort of tension in all of this. They've asked, it seems awkward or difficult to plant something that doesn't really want to be planted there, and as a result, it hastens its demise in a sense. Can you, Andy or Jack, can you talk about that tension and that this idea of kind of resistance?
I would like to just say that like our forebears, the idea was always that you go through life, there is a beginning and there is an end, and then there is a passing to generations. There is a natural process, as it should be, and then there are those processes where it is imposed upon you. And more than anything, the Holocaust was so much taking of lives when they should have been able to get fulfilled. So I think in our case, it's not the idea that the trees shouldn't die. It's that they should be given a chance to flower in life and then go through their lives and then pass on to the next. And that is for us a very important tradition. So I would just say that the symbolism of a tree, which has a beginning and an end, is very much consistent with what we do. And just to be allowed to have its life go through and then go on to the next generation in the appropriate, respectful, and ongoing manner is very important for us. Andy, if you want to say anything, I jumped in first.
Articulated that extremely well, and whilst it is a garden, it is a Holocaust memorial, and it's a tough place too, and it is not a there should be a kind of a certain harshness and toughness to its nature.
Yes, I think that's the concept of resilience and renewal are so important and so well captured.
Overwritten by this life, the life.
Yeah. Resilience, renewal, and life. Very, very, very key words. Jory, I think we're close to our curtain time. I could go on for a long time. I know that in the time we've been talking, it has gone from light to dark behind Andrew, so we should remember it is now 5 p.m. and we've taken a nice amount of time. Andy, I just have to tell you that this was wonderful, inspirational, and I find every time that I feel if I've had something difficult at the museum happen, or if you walk through and something particularly is impactful, I find a walk through the garden is one of the most inspiring things that I have. And for me, one question I'd like to ask you, my favorite time of the year at the garden is actually the winter, when the leaves are down and the view is straight through to this incredible location we have, and the context of being able to see both the Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island through these incredible stones and trees is for me a very important moment. Do you have a favorite time of the year there, Andy?
I tend to go in the winter for some reason. That's when I've seen it. But I think when it's down to the lines of the tree and the round of the boulder, then yes, that and I don't usually have what would be called a favorite season, favorite time. I don't sort of ascribe to that. But in the case of the garden stones, yes, winter is for me.
Great. And each season brings a whole different focus on the sense of the God. There's a certain constancy to it, but the season itself, whether it's in full bloom, whether the leaves are falling, or whether the leaves are emerging, or whether the trees are bare, that each has its own sense of, you know, stages of life as well. Jory, I think we've used up our time, and Andy, and for all the people who work with you, and for Charles, you know, thank you for helping to make something happen at the museum that has had tremendous impact, not only on our members, but for survivors, their families. And we are very grateful and very proud to be able to feature this work in the museum.
Well, thank you very much. This has not just been for me a Zoom event. It's actually for the people who watch. This is the work in progress. These kind of discussions is what this work is about. Great.
So thank you, Andy. Thank you, Charles Day, wherever you are. You were wonderful. And Jory, thank you very much. And why don't you close the program?
Sure. Yes, thank you so much, Jack and Andy, for being with us today and giving us a closer look at the Garden of Stones. It was so special to hear it directly from both of you. And of course, thank you so much to our members. We'll be offering member programs every month. So please look out for your member newsletter, which is emailed to you every Monday and has everything you need to register for all of our virtual programs. And special thanks to Liz Bauer, Holly Goldsworthy, and Charles Day for all you did to make this program possible. Thank you so much, and take care. Have a great rest of your day. And have a good night, Andy.
Thank you very much. All right. Goodbye.